Gathering drinks, finding a spot, and we'll get started. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us at UNSW Canberra's 2026 Leadership in Action. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor Emma Sparks, the Dean and Rector at UNSW Canberra, and I'll be your MC for this evening. We're delighted to be hosting this event on beautiful Ngunnawal country with so many distinguished guests. It's wonderful to bring together members of our university, industry, and alumni communities here this evening to hear from a truly outstanding leader and trailblazer, Danielle Wood. To begin the proceedings, I'll invite the Vice-Chancellor and President of UNSW, Professor Attila Brungs, the lectern, to deliver the welcome address.
Thanks kindly, Emma, and I'd like to repeat, Emma, a very warm welcome to you all. It's delightful to see so many people here tonight, and it is great to have this conversation, and again, to hear wonderful leadership of our guest speaker, or guest interviewer, interrogation is what you're going to be doing.
Let's go with it.
Interrogation, Danielle Wood. As I start, I'd like to, of course, acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional elders, past and present, on the land on which we stand, paying respects to them. Now, there may be some debate about the meaning of the word Canberra in the Ngunnawal language, but there is no debate that this has been a meeting place for the Ngunnawal for tens of thousands of years. And importantly to a university, knowledge has been developed here for tens of thousands of years. And that's an incredible heritage that we can draw upon. Now, as I said, I'm delighted to see you all here to meet, interact with UNSW people, but also, more importantly, UNSW alumni, but also to hear from Danielle Wood. Danielle began her career as a graduate in the Productivity Commission, now the chair. In between, she's had an incisive and persuasive contributor to policy, to education, to research, to national debate, with roles across the ACCC, the National Economics Research Institute, and the Grattan Institute. She was the first woman appointed the President of the Economic Society of Australia. And after a stellar career in economics, Danielle modelled what we love here at UNSW, which is lifelong learning, keeping learning all the way through your life, by undertaking a Master's in Global Competition and Consumer Law, in her own words, so that she could speak both economics and law, and even more, maybe get them to speak to each other. Now, as growing up in a bilingual household, my family spoke Hungarian, my friends spoke English. I had trouble marrying those two. I think it might be even more difficult marrying law and economics, but Danielle may talk about that tonight. Regardless of what language she speaks with absolute clarity, with passion and with deep knowledge on a topic that I think should be in the forefront of everybody in this room, that of productivity. Coming from the university sector, I would say this, but I fundamentally believe in the transformative power of education, power to change lives, to change communities. But equity and opportunity can only change lives if young people are graduating, have the opportunity to drive that prosperity. And prosperity only comes from productivity. So it is incredibly heartening to hear one of the leading voices in the Australian economy to be such a powerful advocate for productivity and, importantly, the reforms we have to do now to achieve it. Now, Danielle Wood is, of course, in conversation with Patricia, one of the most thoughtful and persuasive contributors to the national conversation. Patricia is an honorary professor at RMIT, and through her career in media and education is a committed advocate for the next generation and building the nation that they will inherit. And rounding off the speakers tonight will be our own Professor Emma Sparks, who's just been reappointed as Dean and Rector of UNSW. And it is an honour to have her continue the role, and I'd like to acknowledge the incredible work that she's done for UNSW over the last 4 years, and thank her. Now, you're going to hear a lot from UNSW. UNSW has been a long part of the Canberra education environment, starting with that for 50 years ago. But now UNSW Canberra represents a once-in-a-generational investment in education, research and innovation right in the heart of the nation's capital. And as part of that commitment, we intend to place ourselves at the heart of national debate more and more through events like this, but not excluding only this. Now, before I hand over, I can't pass up the opportunity to do a little bit of advocacy for Danielle Wood and a consistent work to bring productivity to the forefront of conversations. Because right now, as you all know, with people over there eating into their flexi time, preparing for what I believe is one of the most significant federal budgets for 20 years, 30 years. Because for 20 years, productivity growth in Australia has been non-existent or anemic. Every treasurer throughout that period has talked the talk about productivity, generational inequity, reform agenda, but unfortunately none of them had been able to deliver effective reforms that in any way boosted productivity. And it is not through lack of ideas. We've plenty of those. We've fallen when it comes to the leadership to drive it through. Further, boosting productivity is not easy. It is a challenge in itself. But what we need now in a complex and rapidly evolving world is what I call broad-based productivity improvements, where all parts of society prosper. All parts of society get the productivity benefits. We are in danger, I believe, rarely as ever before, that if we take the wrong approach to productivity, we will accelerate inequities in society. Now, at school, I was taught that leadership is service, serving others. Let me show you, when I was in year 7, that didn't really thrill me. However, over my career, I've learned that makes complete sense. A leader is not a lone voice crying in the wilderness. A leader must be part of a collective action. If, and hopefully when, Jim Chalmers brings down a reform-focused budget, I hope the people in this room will play a part in leading that national conversation to support reform. And on that note, I hand you over to the wonderful interrogator and to Danielle Wood.
Thank you very much. Now, I don't think there's anyone who's really more authentic in her leadership than Danielle Wood, and so it gives me great pleasure to, I think they've set me up as a griller, whereas I was just more sort of going to gently tease out some answers. Let's see if I can try and do both. Danielle, thank you for joining us, and you filled a room. Now, it's not easy to do, and I know there's a bit of competition. You know what the competition is. What's the other thing going on?
It's the Public Sector Data Awards, and as someone pointed out, the Venn diagram of the potential audience is probably reasonably overlapping.
And I just want to say we're winning in here. Okay. Now, you've spoken before about wanting to study economics and being dissuaded, in fact, from doing that. Just walk me through how you developed that determination. It's unusual for a young person to say, I think it's economics for me, and also the response that you got at the time.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it probably comes down to being a bit of a contrarian by nature, and it was, I mean, I knew nothing about economics. I thought it sounded like an interesting word, so I said to my mum, I'm going to study economics, and she said, you'll hate it, it's so boring. And from that moment, I think I was on the path, but like many people who find their passions early, it was fantastic teachers in high school. I had an incredible year 11 teacher who just showed how relevant it was to real world situations. It was a period where there was quite high unemployment, so we talked a lot about labour markets. We had a government that was trying to do budget repair. We were told to, watch the budget. And I have watched every single budget or been in the budget lockup every year since then, so since age 16. And I loved it so much that when my school said that they weren't going to offer economics in year 12, I decided to go to another school to study it. My school was not impressed. They told me I should do accounting because it was the same thing.
Oh, it's so not.
And that was exactly my response. And I think it was just seen as an unusual choice. We have I think, very strange relationship with ATARs and tertiary entrance ranks, and you're seeing if you're going to get a good one, you should do the things that have a good one. You're wasting your ATAR, all very strange. But, I knew from early on that it seemed to be an area where it was a way of thinking that suited my brain, but also that I really felt that you could have something to say about the big issues facing the country.
And we are going to talk about the big issues facing the country and the way you tackle them, but I want to focus on you a bit longer before we zoom out to the actual issues that people like you are trying to resolve. You co-founded the Women in Economics Network. Just take us back to why you did that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, at that point, I was an economist for over a decade. I had, certainly observed that it was a male-dominated profession.
It was hard to miss, wasn't it?
It was hard to miss. And certainly at the senior levels, it was an extremely male-dominated profession. And, I generally had a good experience. I'd been in the public service for those years, which I think is a bit more thoughtful on these issues overall. But the Economic Society actually decided to hold a retreat. And they invited a whole lot of mid-career women along, and I just sort of lobbed in an application, not really thinking that I would have a 6-week-old baby at the time the retreat was held. But anyway, grabbed my baby, took her to McLaren Vale. It was 25 or so women, mainly academics actually. And it was actually the stories that they told over the course of those 2 days that I found incredibly galvanising. So, it's like all the tropes, having credit taken for your work, being confused with the tea lady, just, and I don't know if it was the hormones, I was so angry and frustrated, and it was a small group of us actually at the retreat that said, we have to do something. We did find out sometime later that a group of women had tried to form a Women in Economics network in the 90s, but told there was no possible need for such a thing. But we had more luck, and we were pretty determined. We worked through the Economic Society, and we really saw, we had to work on the pipeline. We had to be able to attract young people, and economics is a bit on the nose with young people in general, but particularly young women into the discipline. We had to show them, what I had found at a young age, that it is relevant and impactful. We had to create a space for women to talk about the work that they were doing. So many fantastic events where you're just hearing women talk about their incredible research, whether they're private sector academics or in government. And then we wanted to work on the problem of visibility. And a short time after forming the network, I had a call from Stream, the media monitoring company, and they said, we've done a survey of the top voices in economics, and we've mapped out the top 50. Congratulations, you're number 50. But there's only 7 women in the top 50, and Shane Oliver has more quotes than all of those 7 women combined. So women were just almost entirely invisible in economic debates. And I think that was having an impact on who people saw as an economist, but also the nature and calibre of those debates. So,
well, thank you for going there, because a lot of the discussions we have about why we want to address issues of representation at the top often revolves around that we just some sort of natural order of things, try and do it. But what you were trying to identify is that perhaps the nature of the debates, as you say, would change if women were being involved in the economic development. How has it changed?
I think it is generally broader. I think there is a stronger message around the overlap, sort of what Attila was saying with productivity and growth, but the need to ensure that reaches everyone. I think there's stronger recognition of areas of interface, like women's participation and the role that's played in economic transformation. I mean, just as an example, I started doing some work on ECEC and then the cost of childcare and how it impacted work incentives. And I was talking to a very senior person in government, and he's like, "Oh, I thought we fixed that." And it was just so interesting to me. I mean, he's a fantastic policy brain, but I think him and the people that he surrounded himself with just weren't seeing it in the day-to-day life. So there's something about the lived experience that you bring. I think there is also something just around broader diversity and ways of thinking that tends to lead to better outcomes. There's a fantastic study that I like that showed 2 tasks that you could kind of objectively assess. They put together a diverse team and a non-diverse team. The diverse team did better. They were more creative in how they got to the solution. You asked them how they felt afterwards. The non-diverse team said they had a much nicer time, and it was all very nice because everyone sat there nodding and agreeing with each other, but we can see that they didn't do as well on the task. So there is something, it might be uncomfortable to be in rooms with people that think really differently, that have different experiences and mindsets, but it's going to help you get to a better place.
It's striking that someone who now leads the Productivity Commission would have been discouraged actively by a range of people to actually study economics. What does that say about the subtle barriers that can shape particularly young women's choices? And do you think those barriers still exist today?
Look, I think there's a general issue of lack of understanding of labour markets when people are forming career choices. Like there's an OECD survey that ask 15-year-olds what they're going to be when they grow up. And 60%, something in that vicinity, pick from 10 careers. And they're a little bit different between girls and boys, but, lawyer, doctor, nurse, police officer, basically the ones that are on TV.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you actually looked at what fraction of the labour market those things are, it's tiny, absolutely tiny. We have this very narrow sense of future career possibilities. I think parents feed into that. You know, they come from a good place. They're worried about, you know, will my child have a career path? But it tends to mean that they push kids into those things. So I think that is a big challenge, and actually we need to be talking about the kind of skills we want people to develop and what kind of course might help them develop those skills that will help them wherever they land in the workforce. But is there a gendered element still? Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I've been shocked with my own daughter. I mean, it was literally like the first week she was in ECEC, 1 year old, and they said, oh, the boys, there was a construction site across the road, the boys love watching the trucks move in and out. I'm like, they're one, it's colour and movement. Like all kids, you know, like it's just extraordinary how those things start to be cued really early. You see girls losing confidence as early as primary school in maths ability. And so I think those subtle kind of messages are still there and are still shaping choices.
I think that's absolutely correct. And so now we have, 3 women at the head of basically different economic...
5.
Is it, okay, we'll go through it because and also whether you think there's been a nexus between the establishment of the Women's Economic Group and the pipeline you talk about so that these elevations, including your own, could happen.
So, I mean, it's a really tremendous list. So we've got Jenny Wilkinson, Treasury Secretary, Gina Cascott-Lieb, Head of the ACCC, Michelle Bullock at the RBA, Sarah Court recently announced as Head of APRA, and myself. And to give you a sense, they are all the first women to lead those organisations. So we had a period where there had not been any independent economic institutions led by women in this country. You've always got to be kind of modest in drawing connections, but I think when we formed the network, you know, we had Chris Bowen speak at one of our events, and you know, he was Shadow Treasurer at the time, and he said, "Look, you know, this doesn't seem right. This is weird that we haven't had any women."
It's pretty weird.
So I think it was kind of putting it on the radar, and let's remember, a lot of these, including my position, are appointed positions. It's ultimately the minister that has the say. I think it did add visibility to the fact that it was very strange that in such a long time there had never been a woman head those institutions.
Let's talk about, I mean, you know, it gives it away in the title. This is very much about how to lead and how to lead with authenticity. And I think authenticity has become a bit of a buzzword at the moment. So let's kind of interrogate how you view it. Leadership, particularly in the economic field, and you mentioned all of these particular roles. I mean, we've never had a female treasurer, right?
Yep, still some glass ceilings left. Yep. Watch out, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a female finance minister, though, and in the shadow portfolio now, too. So, you know, let's not discount those women and the work they're doing. Katie Gallagher works pretty hard in her portfolio. So that there is obviously movement here. But that kind of approach to more women being in these key roles, are we seeing the kind of reform work that goes with that? You've mentioned the childcare space, some of these bigger ideas around changing the kind of policy focus. Has that shift happened, or are we not quite there yet?
Look, I mean, I think we should recognise what has happened. I think there has been a lot of focus on ECEC, and now we're having a, you know, very important focus on quality of services and safety, and that's a super important conversation. There's been some important breakthroughs on parental leave, you know, both expanding the entitlement to paid parental leave, which is, you know, shown to, you know, be great for mums and babies and keep women attached to the workforce. Also now leave set aside for dads and partners, and, you know, some really great new data showing that dads are now much more likely to take leave in those early years than they were before, and we know from the overseas experience that has all sorts of great longer term impacts. So I think there has been progress on some of these issues. I think, you know, we have to be realistic. Governments have a lot of priorities, a lot of budget trade-offs, as you know, Patricia, but, you know, I think they have focused on some of these really important policy levers.
So right now, you have an enormous platform at a time when I think we're going through like seismic changes in our economy, and of course the global headwinds, which we know about. Like, you know, you wouldn't have missed a war that's going on that's wreaking havoc with our energy markets, right? It's a big political moment too. Your job is not political, but you want to drive a policy agenda at a time where politics is very fractured. Just talk to me about how you think about that in such a contested space, and whether you think we are right now in a moment where genuine reform and some of these things you've been working on for a long time are about on the cusp of being delivered.
I think it does feel like a moment, and we know there's a lot of political barriers to reform, but you know, when you have a government elected with a very big majority, we know year 2 tends to be the year when the hard things happen. So, you know, for anyone that's ever hoped for reform, this feels like there's a lot of stars aligned. The international environment, I think, cuts both ways. I think on the one hand, it just chews up a lot of bandwidth, and we were talking about this before we got on stage. You know, governments, you know, it has almost felt like a sort of series of rolling crises over the past 5 years. And, you know, I know there's a lot of people in the public service here. You know, that's meant that people have been dragged into just responding to external events, and that makes it harder to kind of do the long-term work of reform. On the other hand, it really emphasises the need for domestic resilience. And, you know, I think Mark Carney, Canadian president's been really good in articulating this, and we're hearing the Treasurer talk about this more as well. When the world is uncertain, you want to be match fit at home. And so doing what you can to improve your productivity, you know, whether that's reducing frictions in the system, whether it's working on human capital, you know, there's a whole lot of different levers that, you know, we have been talking about for a long time, that it does feel like, you know, now might be the moment.
So often when you're in a position like yours, you have to sometimes deliver difficult ideas to people who are very powerful, who, you know, in their defence have to sell it and get re-elected, which is a different job to one that you have and public servants have. So they have got a wicked job. Just talk to me about being disruptive, perhaps being unpopular, picking your moments. I want you to talk to me about the way you've led in a difficult situation, standing up on ideas that are sometimes unpopular, but governments need to hear, and how you've done that, how you've thought about that.
I mean, it's the thing that I think about a lot. You know, Productivity Commission is set up to be an independent body. We are funded by government, but you know, I'm a statutory appointment. My commissioners are statutory appointments. We have, basically, it's impossible to sack us for 5 years, and that's so we can say hard things. It's kind of wild that we exist, and I have all these international delegations come through, and they're like, "Sorry, what? Government's paying for you guys to say these really tricky political
that annoy
things?"
them?
Yeah, and it's partly an accident of history, but you know, I think it reflects the political maturity that governments of both stripes have kept us over time. So the way I think about it is, you know, we are set up to give advice in the national interest. That's a very clear edict to us. A lot of our work comes commissioned by the government, so they will ask us some of these hard questions, and then essentially we go away, we do consultation, we do the analysis, and we give at the end of that the best evidence-backed advice that we can give on what we think the national interest position is. And sometimes that will mean testing the boundaries. Sometimes it will mean saying things that we don't think are frankly going to get picked up this year or next year. We might be thinking, you know, we're trying to shift the horizon for 10 years.
Okay, that's really interesting. Sounds like an ambit claim. Talk to me about how you think about that, or how you talk about it within the Productivity Commission as much as you can. I understand, obviously, it's a deliberate kind of, you know, confidential process, but how you think about shifting the dial on big ideas.
So, I mean, I think that across our body of work, we should have a mix, and it should be a mix of things, which are the big boundary shifting things that are not in the window currently, but we would like to be, and things that governments can do today. And, you know, in some areas, and I'll use climate change as an example because I think it's the clearest cut one. I mean, we have been banging on for 20 years about why we should have a carbon price because it's the most efficient way to address reductions. I mean, I could do another report that says that, or I could talk about a whole series of changes to the status quo that push us closer to that direction. And the way we think about that is like, we should always say what first best is. So I will always say the most efficient way to address carbon emissions is to have a carbon price. But if governments aren't going to do that, then here are some ways that they can improve what is there. So we kind of really actively kind of think about how do you balance that pragmatism, first best, second best. The other issue that we have to deal with, which is perhaps more spicy, is when we might intervene in public discussions independent of reports that we have. And it's not something we do lightly. The way I think about it is, have we got a back book of work so I have a well-informed view, and do I think an intervention could help shift the debate in a positive way? So those sort of interventions are rare. You know, I'm not here to provide a rolling commentary on policy or the government. You know, that doesn't serve anyone.
So how do you make that decision?
I think about those criteria, and I think about, you know, particularly whether I think it's going to be helpful in shifting the dial and debate. I know it won't be popular.
Can you give us an example of when you've done this and when you've thought, you know, this is not going to be easy, but I have to do it?
I mean, probably some early interventions on the Future Made in Australia program, and
Still not a fan of it, are you?
well, look, you know, what we said is I think there was a newfound enthusiasm for industry policy around the world. We've historically been sceptical, certainly very alive to the risks. And what we said is, you know, there might be certain circumstances, but let's be really clear about what they are and make sure that we're weighing up the very real costs of these interventions. And, you know, it wasn't a welcome intervention. Governments were announcing all these fun, exciting things. But, you know, what did come out of it, which I think was great, was, you know, Treasury went away. They put out what they called a national interest framework. It was essentially a really structured way for thinking about what does good industry policy look like. Whether that's being followed or not is a separate question, but I think it did lead to, you know, greater structure in the thinking about when this makes sense and when it doesn't.
And when have you not intervened?
I mean, every
Good
day,
question,
right?
yeah. Okay, so of course we're off the record. No, we're not quite, are we? We're streaming. But when do you think, okay, I do have a strong view on this, but I'm going to let this play out?
I mean, there's tons of areas because, you know, I've had a history in policy for a long, you know, I worked in tax policy for a long time.
Well, I was about to say, at the moment we're having a big discussion about the capital gains tax discount and, of course, negative gearing and the way that tax and transfer system works. This must be a moment too.
But it's not something the Productivity Commission
But the
has
work you've
worked
done
on.
with the Grattan Institute was really centred around a lot of that, right?
Yeah, and so if I'm asked about it in an interview, I will mention that work and talk about it at a high level. But, you know, would I go in and make a very strong intervention in the public debate? No, I wouldn't, because I'm the Productivity Commissioner and I need to be backed up by work from the Commission. So I leave that to others that are at the Grattan Institute or have elsewhere progressed that work. So yes, I will mention it, but I certainly wouldn't actively try and put myself into that debate.
No. You have published extensively, though, if I can go to this, on intergenerational inequality, which is kind of the buzz term of our moment. And it's kind of shared, I'd say, interestingly, by the left and the right in different ways. So, you know, we talk a lot about polarisation, but I think there is a kind of consensus that's built that something is unfair, that the system feels cooked for people. A lot of that work points the finger at policy settings that benefit older, wealthier Australians at the expense of younger voters. That's a very politically difficult message. Just in terms of the body of work you have, and I understand your Productivity Commission hat is not what we are talking to here, but this is you as a leader, a broader sort of range of time. Have you often had to point to research that makes people uncomfortable, that kind of pushes people's like we have a sort of stratified way that we operate in Australia, and it really pushes the envelope on some of those issues.
Yeah, my parents were actually pretty happy when I left the Grattan Institute.
That's
'cause half their
hilarious.
friends wouldn't talk to them anymore. So I did. I thought a lot about this question, and actually, this is probably a very non-economist answer, but I think when you're in these very contentious, contested, and they're emotional debates often, trying to understand the kind of psychology of the people that are going to disagree with you is important. And what I found actually in some of those intergenerational ones, particularly the tax issues, is what people were hearing, which is in no way what we're intending, is you've done something wrong. By using the tax concession here or negatively gearing a property here, you've personally screwed young people. And, as an economist, I've got, well, no, of course that's not what I'm saying. You're entitled to use whatever. We're just saying the system needs to change. So, being really careful. And it was interesting actually listening to Allegra Spender frame her tax thing the other day. She actually made that point explicitly. We're not saying anyone's done anything wrong. So you've actually got to kind of work with the psychology. The other thing that we tried to do a lot of is to frame it in a positive way. And I think you're right. This question of, we want to leave a better world for our kids and grandkids. That's a universal impulse. So trying to frame it in the positive, can we do things that are going to help next generations be better off? I think was helpful. Yes, there were still a lot of people that were angry and disagreed, but I think it's a more fruitful way to try and bring people along to those difficult messages.
Yeah, I think the OK Boomer movement was very ill-judged, wouldn't you say?
Look, I think just, and people were trying to be funny, but I just think anything that, creates this kind of sense of generational war. And there's, I'm trying to write a speech at the moment on kind of zero-sum thinking, this sense that we've just got a pie that we're fighting over, as opposed to there's a whole lot of policy settings that can actually grow that pie. We've got to get out of that zero-sum mindset, and I think, that it does lead to a lot of polarisation in debate, but also just people kind of retreating into their corners and not being able to listen to the arguments.
That's right. And the media is part of that, the sort of winners and losers prism. You hate that, don't you?
I absolutely hate it. I just think we do not give people enough
How
credit.
many lists have I written of winners and losers in my career?
Yeah, it just condenses down every single policy decision to what does it mean to my hip pocket. And of course that is important to people, and I'm, not here to say we're like post-materialist or anything, it matters, but if in doing that you lose the story of, why are we doing this? What's in the national interest? What is the bigger picture here? You just make it hard to do things. And, we say, why are we not doing enough reform? We've made it bloody hard for politicians to do hard things because they know that's the first thing that's going to be on the front page, and probably it's going to run for the next 4 months if it's a tax change.
So where does that leave you in terms of being able to shape that debate? You have a big platform, huge influence. Do you think actively about back to the interventions of shaping the debate to try and make it easier for the politicians? And what I mean by that is not in a give them an easy run, because you wouldn't ever hear me say that, but actually be able to kind of open up the debate so that it doesn't become so tightly where they have to rule things out, where they have to close things down before scare campaigns gather pace and everyone, wants to shut ideas down.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I came into this role, I thought very deliberately about that, and we deliberately as an organisation have been a lot more public in what we do. So, you will see myself and commissioners out doing a lot more speeches. We do more opinion pieces. We do more targeted media. And the idea of that is, not just to advocate for certain things that we've recommended, although we use it for that as well, but to actually try and till the ground. And if you look at, when reforms are possible, it's when governments and others have made the case over an extended period that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. So it's the reason why I'm always going out banging about productivity and the challenges and why it matters, and trying to make that very real in terms of people's living standards. It's why I still talk about intergenerational inequality and areas like housing that I think, I'm a subscriber to the housing theory of everything that says unaffordable housing sits at the heart of all our social and economic problems. The more I think we can help governments in telling that message, then hopefully the easier it is for them to do some of the hard things.
In terms of your leadership of the Productivity Commission, I mean, I've been, knocking around Canberra for a very long time, and the Productivity Commission has always had the reputation historically of being very economically dry, really missing, if I can, this is just my take, just to be clear, but, not having the heart and soul of a sort of broader social policy. You approach things a little bit differently. Have you ever felt sort of pressure to lead in a particular way, given the sort of historical constraints of a body like that?
I actually haven't.
Well, that's good.
I think it...
I'm happy to hear that.
I mean, it's interesting, and in a way I think being a very different choice freed me up, and I'll say one of my predecessors has said to me, I've felt pressure to be like Gary Banks. There was this sort of, he'd been there for a long time, he had a particular style, and, this sense that you had this kind of organisational history in your hands. I didn't feel that same pressure. I would say that the organisation, despite the kind of view that people might have of it, had evolved significantly already. So, over time we expanded the remit from trade, industry policy, productivity, to social policy, to environmental policy, increasingly to First Nations policy. So it was already a much broader church, and I think, what we've been focused on is trying to tell, the story of some of those same economic reforms, but why they matter for people and why they will deliver better living standards for Australians, try and make it really concrete for people.
The sort of common mantra that we hear is that all of the reform period of the 80s and the 90s is all over. We're living in the doldrums. It's all very doom and gloom. It's quite depressing, actually, if you subscribe to it. But if you're honest, if we're all honest, and you addressed this a little earlier, productivity has been in the doldrums genuinely, right, for a long time. And productivity enhancing reforms have been put off routinely by governments. What do you think is holding us back? And if you were the Treasurer, right, and you can say what you like because you're independent and he can't sack you, just try him, like really. What would you do in this budget at this moment?
I have given him 15 recommendations that
You
he
have.
can move on. Look, let me...
You can't have all of the toys though, Danielle. What would you do as if you were framing this budget and you didn't have the political restraints, and I know that's kind of big part of it, the political restraints, but what would be good for the collective improvement of people's kind of, growing the pie as you talk about it for the country now?
So I will answer your question, but can I also just slightly reject the premise? So it's a very political thing to say. I think it is true that we've probably done less reform, but I think we also are not very good at giving credit to governments for the things that they have done. So safeguard mechanism, vehicle efficiency standard, we have really good market mechanisms in climate that are starting to have an impact. The EPBC reforms, really important regulatory reform. Not doing things like not rushing in and putting tariffs on in response to Donald Trump. These things are all big and important. So I do like to give credit when credit's due, because I think if we all just say, oh, governments are hopeless, they might bother doing nothing. Where should they start in this budget? we have given a whole series of recommendations in reports. I think a big theme, and there's several pieces that sit under this, is regulation and regulatory reform. And I was doing these reports, they were called the 5 Pillars reports, because it was recommendations on the government's 5 pillars of productivity reform. The one thing that I heard most universally from not-for-profits, from business, was this sort of huge impact of regulatory burden and well beyond the kind of compliance cost. like board time spent on regulatory compliance issues has gone from 25% to 55% in a decade. So all our top minds at companies, universities, are spending their time thinking about compliance rather than investment, taking risks. So this really matters. We think, and we've made a series of recommendations, big leadership statement from government akin to a charter of budget honesty, a target to reduce regulatory burden, deep dives in certain areas, improvement in the infrastructure. I'd like to see him say this is a priority and we're going to go hard on this. I think, tax reform, as I said, I'm not going to advocate particular things, but we have made some recommendations around corporate tax reform, but I think there is a really important conversation around individual taxation. The kind of reforms people are talking about, I would say are about reducing concessions and leakages and using that money to reduce the rate and improve incentives to work for working age Australians. And I do think that is, certainly a defensible economic package. So those are a couple of the areas. One, I'll point to a social one as well, if I can, because I think this is a really important one. And then probably people in this room that work in this area, we have increasingly good data and understanding of early interventions we can make in particularly social services areas, but health as well, that reduce human suffering and save government's money down the track. They are super hard to do because budget processes are all about offsets in a 4-year window and offsetting within a portfolio. One of our recommendations is a fund to kind of disrupt that barrier to funding high quality early interventions. And I would love to see the government pick that up as well. We could really revolutionise the way that we provide social services in this country if we were to adopt that type of model.
What reform do we talk about too little?
Definitely not tax.
That's our favourite, isn't it?
I mean, I think there is a piece, and I haven't spoken about it at the PC either, so I'm guilty too, but around people's interaction with the system. And we all sit in our ivory towers and we talk about tax and regulation and highfalutin, but there's just the day-to-day, what is it like when I am trying to deal with Centrelink? Answer, when I actually finally had to once, I was like, oh, this is extraordinary. If politicians actually, had to do this, I think there would be change. So this big push, and it was done in New South Wales, which is fantastic. Victor Donatello was incredibly active and enthusiastic in trying to make government more seamless for people. So a push around digital government, but really focused on the kind of consumer experience. How do we reduce the frictions? And I just think that would improve people's days. It would give them back time and mental energy. But I also think it was, help with faith in government in general. If people are having a good experience when they deal with government, they're more likely to buy into, governments taking on other hard issues.
How do you stay motivated even if your goals seem out of reach?
Ooh. I mean, I think breaking them down into things that are a little bit more tractable, and whether you've got a big long-term career goal or you're just doing like a massive big report like we do at the PC, I think trying to map out the steps along the way so that they are achievable is important. Celebrating milestones, like I have a tendency to do this, and I think it's pretty common. I got there, let's think about the next thing, but actually like stopping and reflecting as you go, I think is important for motivation as well. And I said this to Patricia when we were talking on the call about this conversation. I think signalling to people where you want to go. So if this is a question about career, if you see yourself in a certain role and maybe you're not there yet, start telling people that that's where you want to go. You'll be surprised at how many people will then kind of come along to help you along the way, and people will start sort of thinking about you and seeing you in that capacity. So don't be shy. Forward signalling is a very powerful tool.
Well, you've been quite unambiguous about your ambition, right?
I mean, I think I have used that. Not
I'm giving you a compliment.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, ambition is still frowned upon, I think, for women, especially if they're not shy about it and they tell you. But how key has it been to the way that you've, you know, by telling people I want to lead the Productivity Commission, I'm not here just for good times. I have lots of ideas for what I want to do. How important was that throughout your career? And when did you have that realisation that that's the way you should achieve power and influence?
And the reason I'm hesitating is I haven't always had that. And so, for example, when I became CEO of the Grattan Institute, I didn't actually apply to be CEO of the Grattan Institute. I didn't go for that job because, you know, partly, you know, I've had a young child and family circumstances. Partly, you know, I didn't think I was ready for that job. So
The old not ready.
So, you know, I've fallen into that trap, and the only
Women always think they're not ready.
Yeah, but you know, like, arguably, you know, I had been at the level below only a few years. You know, like, it was honestly, it was line ball in my mind, and it was only because the board decided to do a survey of the staff about what they thought the next leader should look at. And Stephen Duckett, one of our program directors, came into my office. He said, "Oh, I've done the survey and I've actually realised it's you." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Oh, and I've called the board chair and I've told him I think it's you. And you've got till Monday to work out whether you're going to apply or not." And so I was literally pushed. So that was an example of the opposite. And, you know, I'm genuinely grateful that he did that and gave me that push. I think for the type of job that I'm in now, though, I did realise that forward signalling piece mattered. And because they are hard jobs to get. As I said before, there are appointments, so even though there are processes, there's other things that go on. And so
do you have to lobby for yourself?
I didn't lobby, but I told people that were in similar roles that I was interested one day, and they, you know, ended up putting me forward and lobbying for me. But it was only through communicating that was something that I was interested in doing.
So, you know, it's one of the most cliche questions that can be asked, but I love it because it's such a good question. But the kind of advice to your younger self question, would that be it? To be, you know, less reluctant about ambition?
Yep, I think that is certainly something that I could have taken on board at an earlier age and would have been helpful. Honestly, like, though, if I was going to give my young self one piece of advice, it's just to let go of perfectionist tendencies. Like, the most freeing thing for me actually was returning to the workforce with a young child and just not having time to wheel spin, and just realising 80% is good enough. You can get a long way just like feeling freed from all that additional thinking and trying to get that last 20%. Like, you'll be fine.
Yeah, I became much more productive after I had children too, and I'm not saying that's a universal thing. You have to have children to be productive, but yeah, your time becomes very precious, doesn't it? So
yeah, it forces you to be way more aggressive in those trade-offs, and then you realise the world doesn't fall in.
Yeah. So that part of the job too, you do have children and you are, you know, you've got a big job, and I think, and I reckon there are many younger women in this room who are probably have thought about, you know, the modelling that people like you provide for being able to do really big jobs and also have families. How have you approached it?
I plan a lot. I push a lot to my partner, and I outsource. Like, so I think about, you know, what's important to me, and you know, I make certain times that are just non-negotiable, and they're for my daughter, and we have certain rituals and things that we do, and that is absolutely quality time. I always work from home on Mondays. I do pick-ups and drop-offs on that day, but then I kind of push, you know, and you know, gender norms are very real, and I didn't get it right early on. I defaulted to, even though I had the bigger job, to being the carer and the mental load bearer and all of those things.
Danielle Wood, even you.
Yeah, I was doing it all, and then I was just like, what am I doing? You know, I'm writing about all this stuff about the importance of sharing, but, you know, I think, you know, women kind of just have this natural tendency to want to take it on, and you have almost this level of martyrdom. I've got to do this, and I've got to, spinning the wheels. And I thought, wait a minute, no. And my partner's extremely capable of doing it, and just said, no, actually, this is what I'll do. This is what you'll, actually being kind of clear about roles and this is what we'll outsource. And that's a super privileged thing, right? Like that, the capacity to bring in a cleaner and do some of those things is a very privileged position to be in. But that is how I make the hours in the day add up. You sacrifice.
But what I'm really interested in, and I think a lot of women are, and I've picked this up in my own conversations where people ask questions, is the deliberate nature of that. And I don't think we talk about thinking ahead and planning for that. So if we talk about a pipeline of women being able to do big jobs and take up space and leading with authenticity and doing things differently, we have to also talk about gender norms not just being dealt with later, but actually being actively thought about before we even get to having the children, right? Like having those conversations with your partner. I did with mine, but I'm in a same-sex relationship, so I think some of those gender norms were different. But having those conversations before you do it, rather than getting yourself into a trap where all of a sudden, like the smartest girls you go to school with, and, sometimes careers languish later because they have been in a trap of society's making. How deliberate do you need to be as you kind of think about it?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be absolutely deliberate. And as I said, I wasn't always. I mean, I just think people have different preference sets. People have different career trajectories. And, it's not always going to be the woman that is the right person in any particular relationship to be the dominant carer at a given point in time. It doesn't make sense that that is always the outcome. So we should question the defaults, and it should be a negotiation between partners as to what works best in your particular circumstances, given the preferences in the relationship. And I actually always test this now. When I know a couple that's having a child, I'm always like, ask both of them, what are you planning for leave? And it is amazing still, as you say, even amongst real high flyers, how much they just haven't thought about it. So, I think the deliberateness does matter.
So, Danielle did this thing, which was sort of kind of trapped her in a situation where I'm going to now trap her, where she went on LinkedIn, and some of you may be here because of that, and she said she didn't want to be grilled on industrial relations, for instance. And when I read that, I thought, I'm going to have to change my approach here and ask her about some of the...
I'm pretty sure I said industrial policy in my defence.
You did. So let's talk about some of the wicked things going on at the moment. And they are, right? There is a push in the sovereignty space for a renationalisation, for instance, of policy. You mentioned the future made in Australia, so I am going to grill you briefly, and then I'm going to come to your questions too. I'm a bit of a mic hog, but I do like to share occasionally, and I'm planning to any moment. So if you've got great questions, think of them now, and I'll ask for your hand up in a moment. Not quite yet. But are you worried about the direction some of these debates are going in, which is increasingly, it seems to me, and I've been covering it, more protectionist. You've been worried about the way we will allocate resources going into the future around some of the debates we're having. Are you worried that we're going into directions that may not be in our best interests?
I am worried, which is why I raised this early on. And we are in a different world. So let me start there. There has been a very big shift towards, or a re-embracing of industrial policy across the world, and partly there's some new motivations for that. One is economic resilience and security, and I think it is undeniable. Obviously, we are in a more volatile global environment. There have been challenges in the global economic system from the just huge ramp up in China's industrial capacity. So does it make sense to respond to that? Yes, in a very limited set of circumstances. We've got to think about it as an insurance policy. we may need to ensure supply of certain things. And that can be different ways. We can stockpile. Fuel is a live example. Is the stockpile big enough? We'll find out. We could.
Do you think it is?
I'm not going there. We could form alliances with other friendly countries, or we can do domestic production, and we need to think about the relative costs and risks of those. That is a very structured thinking process. It's an insurance question. We know producing domestically will come with costs. Are we willing to bear those costs for the level of extra safety that we're getting? These are really questions that you can kind of work through empirically. Ditto with some of the stuff around the green transition and potential learning by doing with new technologies that may well become competitive down the track. So yes, there are some times when industrial policy makes sense. My concern is when we reduce or release the shackles of government, there's an ever-ending number of firms that are going to turn up and put their hand out for money. And governments are quite, it's quite fun to give out money to businesses, and people, will want to support regions and jobs, and absolutely understand that tendency, but we need to have a structured framework around it. So as I said, that's why I supported the Treasury framework. It's super important that governments be using that to inform its decision making. It's not clear at the moment that is happening.
Okay, and there is now from the left and the right a push for this too, so it's not coming from only one direction. So how important is your platform right now to ensure the integrity of the way we use public money and of the way that we think about what our national, what we're making, what we're doing? I mean, we saw, for instance, and this going to the political sphere, but some key right-wing figures, people like Andrew Hastie talking about we used to make cars in this country, right? There's a lot of nostalgia at the moment about Australia's history and where our jobs used to get made. And I think, and you were very controversial in some of your recommendations here around AI, a real fear, and we haven't talked about the AI kind of elephant in the room, of that really destroying people's jobs. How do we have a sensible debate around that values people's work, but equally is realistic about the changes that we're seeing in the economy?
I mean, I have these kind of two totally different conversations every day. On the one hand, I talk to people in the construction industry, in the green energy industry, in the health and care industries, and they're all saying we do not have enough workers. There are, we have a tight labour market. We have genuine issues of labour shortages amongst so many key areas. So there is almost a strangeness to, we need to protect these jobs. And so yes, we need to do transition, and particularly where there's regional-based transitions, we have to look after people. So I'm definitely not abstracting from that. But the idea that you can kind of push economic water uphill and keep supporting industries that don't have a competitive position into the future is just madness. We know how it ends. It ends with just governments writing checks after checks, and eventually the transition happens anyway, and not in an orderly way. So that is my objection. We can't go back in time, and nor should we want to. And I think there's a kind of a level at which this is a debate about what's a real job and what's a good job as well. I think there's an absolute discounting of services jobs. Like 80% of Australians work in services, probably most people in this room. These are real jobs. They add real value. They make real things. They do real things, and that is the way that economies evolve as they get richer. That's the way Chinese economy is evolving. Their manufacturing share of employment is falling as well. So, I think we have to be realistic about what economies look like. On the AI question, super important one that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I think we all have to be modest when we think about AI. It is evolving really quickly. But on labour markets, the best work is by Jobs and Skills Australia, and Tom McMahon's in the room who did some of this work, I think. What I think they say, which I think is the right midpoint estimate, is that there is a small share of jobs that will be fully automated. Again, that's an important transition. We have to look after those people. But it was something like 4% based on tasks that people do in particular jobs. the much bigger story is augmentation. You know, parts of our jobs can be done by AI. Parts of my job can be done better by AI. It's helping us learn to work with the AIs and to genuinely improve our productivity. And we can take some of that in doing the human part of our job better. We can take it in better quality. We could take it in more leisure. We might take it as higher pay. You know, there's lots of different ways this can manifest. Is there a tail risk that I'm wrong and that we, you know, end up in a world of mass job losses? Like, yes, and we will have to, you know, if we are going there, we are going to be having a really different policy conversation, and I will be there for that policy conversation. That is not a good outcome, but I don't think that's the best guess of where we end up.
What is the main obstacle in terms of leading with authenticity for you?
I think when I think about leading with authenticity, I think of it as leading with your own personality and style. And I think it's that people don't always see that as the personality and style of a leader. And, you know, to the extent that I've struggled with that, it is, you know, people saying, you know, you smile too much, you talk too much, you don't have gravitas. I've actually, you know,
really?
I have had that, and from people, a few times from people I really respect. So I did, you know, kind of, you know, took it quite hard and really grappled with it. And then,
You've got gravitas.
Thanks, Patricia.
How rude. I wonder, did you, and maybe I'm wrong, and I don't mean to see everything through this lens, but was it a very gendered lens or age-based?
That is what I concluded in the end. And like, I'm a person that believes you have to listen to feedback. So, you know, I actually do try and work through it. And I think, is there something here I should be taking away? And I think what I concluded was it was coming from a place of people having a sense of what a leader looked like, how a leader spoke, how they behaved, that just didn't fit me. And, you know, yes, I could pretend to be that, but that wasn't going to serve me well. I think people would tell that wasn't authentic. I think it would be exhausting, frankly. And
impersonation is always badly done too.
Correct. So I ended up saying, well, I'm just going to ignore that particular piece of advice and continue to be myself.
What an excellent ending for our part of the in-conversation. I'm going to ask you, we're going to have microphones go around, to put your hand up if you have a question for Danielle. You don't have to show me up and, you know, make your questions smarter than mine. I've got one over here, or at least do it subtly if you plan to. And there'll be about 15 minutes for people's questions.
Hello. Thank you. That was really brilliant hearing from both of you. Are there aspects of yourself, your authentic self, as you know her, that you are willing to compromise on to get something that's controversial across the line and avoid detracting from the conversation?
Ooh, it's a really interesting question. And I think the thing that I have grappled with is the type of work that I do and the great people at the PC do is very detailed. It's very nuanced. They often want to put lots of caveats around it. But then you go out into the public sphere and you've got to make it comprehensible and understandable. So I've often kind of thought about the trade-off. Where I won't go is I'll never say anything that's wrong. And you know, what drives me crazy in public debates is people that I know that know better, you know, think tanks and other things, saying the good line, but it actually isn't right. And so I will never do that. But what you have to do is find ways to stay true to the underlying reasoning, but do make it simpler. And so you do kind of sometimes lose some of that nuance or the 50 caveats in that public presentation. I do that with my eyes open, and because I think it's really important to get the message across. But as I say, most important thing is that it's always, you're never saying anything that's incorrect or misleading.
That was a really great question. And she kind of looked over at me suspiciously. Did you notice? Like people like that. But being able to deliver a message at the same time that people understand is so key. And that's the sort of the wonk land you all live in versus ordinary people understanding. I'm love to hear any other questions people have, but I'm going to follow up with, you know, you literally are the head of the Productivity Commission. And I think the word productivity and productivity reform is one of the most misunderstood, ill-defined, almost meaningless, no offence to you and your people, terms that we have in the debate.
Very
Am I
specific
right?
definition.
I know,
Like it is,
but yet,
it's like
yet
it's
so
actually
few
the
people,
best defined.
so few people understand it. How important is it to try and get, you know, like nail the points to actually make it relevant to people's lives?
Yeah, look, and we do a ton of thinking about this. Like, do I convert it into dollars of income? Do we talk about it in terms of how many fewer hours you have to work these days to buy a loaf of bread than you did 100 years? You know, there's like lots of different ways we've tried to make it engaging and palatable. Also making, you know, what is a really important point, that it's not just about money. It's actually about improvements in quality in goods and services. Like, we've had extraordinary growth in healthcare productivity. We've taken that in terms of longer and healthier lives. That's fantastic. You know, these are great outcomes. So making it really tangible for people is important. But does the word have baggage? Absolutely. You know, I had a union leader say to me, you know, when my people hear this, they just think it's bosses saying work till you bleed. You know, so like if I had a blank slate paper, I probably wouldn't call us the Productivity Commission, to be honest. I would go with prosperity or something that is...
Productivity Commissioner reveals she wants to change the name. Finally, we've got our story. What would you call it? The prosperity.
I mean, like just something that shows that it is actually capturing...
Good Times Commission.
Yeah, the Good Times Commission. Well, WA actually just launched their 2050 Commission, which is their version of the Productivity Commission, but very fancy and forward-looking.
Well, we'll stick to yours. We've got a question over here. Get a mic to you.
I'm so glad that you referred to prosperity versus productivity, because I think this ties into a question I've been struggling to articulate. So labour is really unequally valued across sectors. I have been in government, I've worked in consulting, I work in a non-profit organisation now. We work with victims of sexual violence, which costs the economy for adult victims $900 million a year, including in lost productivity for those victims. And early intervention matters. The government's recognising this. They've just announced an extension to packages to recruit frontline sexual violence workers. Fantastic news. We can't find them because people don't want to necessarily train for an undervalued, underpaid industry where you may not feel that prosperity because you're working long hours in really challenging conditions. So I wondered where the place in improving productivity might be in empowering, shifting labour tweaks. I don't even know how we'd make it happen from a policy lever positioning, but there's a real pressing need, and it's not just our sector and community, it's education, it's early childhood, it's all of those things that matter so much, not in the next 5 years, but we will feel it in the next 20 years. So I wondered if you had a comment or a magic policy lever for that.
The magic policy lever is pay more. I mean, it is. No, this is a genuine a genuine issue, and you know, part of the challenge is these tend to be funded by government, and that has kind of artificially kept wages lower. Like they're not market clearing in a lot of places, and so you know, ECEC is probably the area that I know best, and you know, we were at the point where you were just seeing a lot of people leave the sector. You know, they're going to retail jobs. They were going to jobs actually where they weren't using their training, but they were getting better pay. And so you know, it was very clear that you know, that was in crisis because of that low pay, and there has been a response from government, ditto in aged care, but it's a huge challenge. Governments that face big budget constraints, they kind of push down for as long as they can. I mean, I think there's probably undeniably a sort of gendered overlay to it as well. You know, particularly in care roles, you know, people are expected to do it selflessly for the common good, but you know, you've got to pay your bills. So that's a very live conversation. I think there has been some movement. Ultimately, if you're not getting the people that you need to deliver the services that governments say they want, the answer is that you have to pay more. And then we need to seriously start talking about trade-offs elsewhere in the budget.
Yeah, well, the trade-offs in the other part of the budget is a key part. I'll just follow up here. I thought I saw a question down here. Am I wrong? You can make yourself ask a question if you haven't already revealed it, but I'll ask a follow-up on the trade-offs. I think that's the wicked issue at the moment, right? That there are more and more demands on the Commonwealth because there are so many big areas where the Commonwealth money flows, to pay people more, where that comes from state budgets on teachers and their agreements, and that there's a strong case for that, to the childcare sector, to nurses, to hospitals. So the trade-off bit, we're not having that part of the conversation, I think, properly in terms of budget, sustainability. What are some of the solutions around that? Because it's kind of an endless list of everyone in these sectors, in this gendered, world needs to get paid more. No one disagrees with that. Well, some people might, but you know what I'm saying. There is a collective, okay, that's right, but where is the trade-off to make that sustainable and affordable?
You're really trying to push me into a whole lot of areas that I'm not even doing work on to talk about.
Well, I'm just commissioning you now, and I'll call the Treasurer later and suggest that happens.
I mean, I think you've got to look at program by program and questions of design. So the government's done some things on aged care in terms of user pays for people that can afford it for services in the home. There is work going on into the NDIS, and you look at the growth rates, and it's clear that governments will have to, and a lot of the original elements of market design weren't well designed to prevent scope creep, and as well as fraud and misuse and some of those things. So it's actually going in, working out, what governments pay for, how should they do it. I think those are really hard conversations, but that's where we are on spending. There's a lot of other spending conversations. How do we choose infrastructure projects? Not with a lot of evidence. There's a whole lots of different things in different areas. So it's super important. In the care sector, there've been areas where it's really hard to get productivity gains because they're labour intensive by nature. That is actually somewhat changing with technology. Really cool examples of AI and rostering for home care, literally saving 20% of people's time that was just on unnecessary logistics. Robots pushing around laundry trolleys in aged care homes, remote monitoring of patients in health. So those things can also free up labour. They can allow you to have you can either improve the quality of the product, or you can have fewer workers but pay them better. So there is actually also some transformation in the technology environment that makes me a little bit more optimistic, and we've got to make sure that government policy actually allows us to embrace those.
What are the big contentious issues that we've been having that you have intervened on? And I just want to get you on this because it was a very political issue as well, is of course working from home. And working from home, like everyone can sort of study how that played out in the last federal election campaign. Obviously, it was highly divisive. But there seems to me to be still a body of work that needs to be done to settle on what that looks like that's the most productive. Do you think we've got there yet, or we are kind of able to have that discussion in a way that's less polarising?
I mean, there is an increasing body of work on the kind of impacts and what works well. My best read of the literature, and it is evolving, obviously, because this has been a kind of relatively new phenomenon, at least in its kind of mass scale, is that, what I'd call well-managed hybrid. Some days at home, some days in the office doesn't seem to have any negative productivity impact. And if anything, some studies show slight positive productivity benefit. That's also like really great for workers, that additional flexibility. I don't know if anyone's seen the data on women's workforce participation. It's like gone up For women in the 35 to 44 age group, it's up 8 percentage points working full time since COVID. Like
Wow.
it's absolutely extraordinary increase, and there's probably a number of factors behind it, but I do genuinely think this flexibility is one of them. So workers and businesses, I think, have an incentive to find that sweet spot. It is valuable to workers. It doesn't seem to be at a productivity detriment. So I was critical of everyone has to come back every day of the week. I think that's madness, and I think we lose this real benefit that's been generated for people by this. I'm also critical of the
Never come in.
government. You have to, it has to be a legislated kind of right, because it is adding this very big regulatory overlay. It's going to pull in a whole lot of businesses where people just can't work from home, that have to justify why they're there. And most people have found the sweet spot anyway and have an incentive to find the sweet spot. So I just think it's an area where government should let the market work. And I think it's been, an extraordinary development and an extraordinary thing for a lot of people's welfare.
Danielle, you are, I think, beyond authentic. You have gravitas.
Thank you.
Let's give her a big round of applause. And thank Danielle for not only leading with authenticity, but also speaking with authenticity. That ends our part of the discussion tonight. And the lectern is returning. I think we are going to conclude very soon. Yeah, you're doing the last bit. It's absolutely on you now.
I think we can all agree that the last just over an hour has been incredibly interesting, but also very thought-provoking. Tonight's conversation between Danielle and Patricia has been a prime example of why we hold these leadership and action events. The reason UNSW Canberra holds the series is to provide a platform to honest dialogue and thoughtful reflection on leadership, what it means, how it evolves, and how we continue to grow as leaders in a changing world. And this year's theme, Leading with Authenticity, is one that resonates deeply with our UNSW community. It's a theme that sits at the very heart of UNSW Canberra's mission. As a tertiary institution, we have the privilege and responsibility of educating and developing Australia's future leaders, leaders who must be capable, ethical, and grounded in values that guide them through complexity and uncertainty. This evening we've had the privilege of hearing from Danielle, who provided us both with practical and thought-provoking insights on the topic of leading with authenticity. Danielle, thank you. We really, really appreciate you spending the time, and also to Patricia as well. Very sharp as always. Can everyone please join me in a final round of applause? Before we wrap up, I want to quickly mention a few things that I've taken from this evening's discussion. The first is that authentic leaders know their values and act on them. Being authentic is not a performance. It's a commitment to aligning words and behaviours, even when the circumstances are challenging or the pressure is intense. Second, authentic leadership requires both courage and transparency. It involves being honest about what we know and also what we don't, and being willing to invite scrutiny and also discussion. In a time when trust is an increasingly precious currency, this kind of openness is essential for strong, credible leadership. And finally, authenticity is grounded in both empathy and humility. Leaders who truly listen are better positioned to understand the people that they serve, to change course when needed, and to build teams and communities that feel valued and empowered. To everyone here tonight, thank you for your commitment to leadership in its many forms. Your attendance shows that leadership is not just something that we study. It's something we practice, that we refine, and that we aspire to every day. I look forward to seeing you all again at our next Leadership in Action event as we continue to explore how we can lead with purpose, with integrity, and with authenticity. So again, my sincere thanks to both Danielle and Patricia for compelling and thoughtful conversation. And also a big thank you to the UNS Canberra team who's brought this event together seamlessly as always, and it is a tremendous effort and it is greatly appreciated. So let's continue the discussion by joining us in Lucky's Speakeasy, which apparently I think is next door, and enjoy some further drinks and canapes. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of tonight.